What if your most intimate betrayal wasn't just heartbreak, but a death sentence? What if the price of forbidden passion wasn't shame or divorce, but fire, water, stone, and rope? Throughout history, when women strayed from the marriage bed, they didn't just face judgment. They faced annihilation. This isn't a story about romance gone wrong. This is about systems of control so brutal, so calculated, that they turned human bodies into public warnings. These punishments weren't carried out in fits of rage or moments of madness. They were written into law codes, sanctioned by emperors, blessed by priests, and cheered on by crowds. From the cobblestone squares of medieval Europe to the colonial settlements of early America, societies across continents built entire mechanisms designed to destroy women who dared to love outside the lines drawn by men. Tonight, we're descending into the darkest chapter of gender and punishment, where betrayal wasn't a private matter, but a crime against the very fabric of civilization itself. And what they did to women accused of adultery will shake you to your core. Let's begin in the murky, cold rivers of medieval Germany, where one of history's most chilling execution methods waited beneath the surface. Between the 13th and 16th centuries, across the territories of the Holy Roman Empire, a punishment so methodical and so terrifying emerged that it still haunts legal historians today. It was called sack drowning, or scucking, and it transformed rivers into graves and justice into theater. Imagine this: a woman stands accused. Perhaps a neighbor saw her speaking too long with another man. Perhaps a pregnancy couldn't be explained away. Perhaps her husband simply wanted her gone. In towns across southern Germany, Austria, and Switzerland, the accusation alone could seal her fate. The Saxon Mirror, a legal code compiled in the 1200s, spelled it out with brutal clarity. Female adultery was an offense not just against a husband, but against his honor, his household, his very name. While men caught in similar acts might pay fines or endure public ridicule, women faced something far worse. The Carolina, issued in 1532 under Emperor Charles V, codified what many regions had already been practicing for centuries. A woman who breaks the marriage bond through adultery may be executed by drowning in accordance with local custom. But this wasn't just drowning. This was ritual obliteration. The condemned woman would be bound at the wrists and ankles, her mouth sometimes gagged to silence her cries. Then she would be sewn into a heavy sack, often weighted down with stones to ensure she sank quickly. But the true horror: in some cases, live animals were placed inside with her. Dogs, cats, even snakes, creatures thrashing and clawing in the darkness as the sack was sealed shut. The logic was both symbolic and sadistic. Just as she had brought chaos into the order of marriage, so too would chaos consume her in death. Officials in cities like Nuremberg and Augsburg carried out these executions with ceremonial precision. Crowds gathered at the river bank. Clergy offered prayers, not for her soul, but for the purity of the community she had defiled. And then, as townspeople watched in silence or jeered from the shore, the woman was thrown into the water. Inside the sack, there was no air, no light, no sound but the muffled roar of the current. She couldn't scream. She couldn't beg. She couldn't even see the faces of those who condemned her. The sack filled with water, pulling her deeper, the weight of the stones dragging her down as her lungs burned and her mind fractured in terror. Death came slowly, in cold, suffocating darkness. The bodies were often left to float downstream, a grotesque warning to any other woman who might consider stepping out of line. There was no burial, no mourning, no grave marker. The river swallowed her whole, and with it, her name, her voice, her very existence. This wasn't about justice, it was about erasure. Drowning, authorities reasoned, was more appropriate for women because it spilled no blood. It was considered cleaner, more dignified than beheading or hanging. But make no mistake, this was gendered cruelty at its most calculated. The punishment was designed not just to kill, but to unmake, to strip the condemned of identity, agency, and memory. She died unseen, unheard, and unmourned, hidden beneath the water like something shameful that needed to be washed away. If you're feeling the weight of this history, if you're starting to see how deep these systems of control ran, then please subscribe. These stories matter. They remind us what happens when power goes unchecked, when fear is used as law, and when one half of humanity is held to standards the other never faces. Hit that subscribe button and join us as we continue pulling back the veil on history's darkest truths. But if you think sack drowning was the worst of it, you haven't yet witnessed what happened when fire met flesh in the town squares of Europe. Because what came next wasn't hidden beneath water. It was performed in broad daylight, with flames that could be seen for miles and screams that echoed through cobblestone streets. The punishment was burning alive, and it turned execution into a spectacle of moral cleansing that entire communities were expected to witness. And the reasons women were tied to those stakes. Sometimes adultery was just the beginning of the accusations. By the 14th and 15th centuries, something darker than law was taking hold across Europe. It was fear disguised as faith, suspicion dressed up as piety, and it needed bodies to burn. Women accused of adultery found themselves swept into a whirlwind of escalating charges that could spiral from betrayal to witchcraft in the span of a single interrogation. The fire wasn't just a method of execution, it was a statement, a purification, a public demonstration that the community could cleanse itself by reducing a woman to ash. In cities across France, the Holy Roman Empire, and parts of Spain, court records began documenting burnings with chilling regularity. In Rouen, France, in 1431, the same year Joan of Arc was burned at the stake, local courts were sentencing women to death by fire for what was vaguely termed immoral conduct. Adultery alone wasn't always enough to justify the flames, but it was the spark that could ignite a much larger fire of accusations. If a woman had strayed from her husband, especially openly or with someone of lower social class, she could quickly be painted as a danger to the entire moral order. Then came the Malleus Maleficarum, published in 1487, a manual that would become the blueprint for witch hunts across Europe. Written by two German inquisitors, this text explicitly linked women's sexual transgressions to spiritual corruption. If a woman was known to have committed adultery, it was only a small leap for accusers to suggest she had also consorted with demons, practiced witchcraft, or seduced men through dark magic. Once labeled a seductress, she could just as easily become a heretic, and from there, a witch. And for witches, there was only one sentence: fire. The execution itself was designed to be unforgettable. It took place in the town square, often on market days when crowds were largest. The condemned woman would be dressed in a simple white or gray garment, her hair sometimes shorn, her hands bound. She would be led through the streets, past neighbors who once greeted her, past the church where she once prayed, past the homes of people who now refused to meet her eyes. At the center of the square stood a wooden stake, tall and thick, surrounded by bundles of dry wood, kindling, and straw. She would be tied to it, ropes cutting into her wrists and waist, her feet barely touching the ground. Clergy delivered sermons. Town criers read her crimes aloud, each accusation met with jeers or solemn nods from the assembled crowd. This was not just punishment, it was a moral lesson, a community ritual, a warning etched in flame. And then, the torch was lit. Fire is not a quick death. It starts slow, licking at the feet and ankles, searing flesh before it burns through. The pain is immediate and overwhelming, but consciousness doesn't always fade fast. Smoke fills the lungs, choking, burning from the inside. The heat becomes unbearable, skin blistering and cracking as the flames climb higher. If the executioner felt merciful, he might strangle the woman first with a rope or garrote, granting her unconsciousness before the fire truly took hold. Or he might use damp wood, creating more smoke and less flame, suffocating her faster, but mercy was not a guarantee. Many women burned fully conscious, their screams swallowed by the roar of the fire and the noise of the crowd. The smell of burning flesh hung in the air for hours afterward, a sensory memory that branded itself into the minds of everyone present. That was the point, to ensure no one forgot, to make sure every wife, every daughter, every woman in that town understood what awaited those who stepped outside the lines. But let's travel even further back, to the cradle of civilization itself, where the very first written laws codified these brutal punishments into stone. Around 1754 BCE, King Hammurabi of Babylon inscribed one of humanity's earliest legal codes onto a massive black stone stele. Among its 282 laws was one that dealt directly with female adultery, and it was unforgiving. Law 129 stated clearly, "If a wife is caught lying with another man, both shall be bound and thrown into the water." The husband could choose to let his wife live, but only if the king pardoned her lover as well. In practice, however, most women received no such mercy. While drowning was prescribed, stoning became the preferred method in many Mesopotamian city-states. It was more public, more participatory, and more symbolic. The condemned woman would be taken to the edge of the city or into a public square, stripped of her clothing and dignity, and placed in a shallow pit or tied to a post. Then the men of the community, elders, neighbors, sometimes even her own husband, would pick up stones and begin to throw, not large enough to kill instantly, but heavy enough to bruise, to break, to bleed. Stone after stone, blow after blow, until she collapsed, until she stopped moving, until she was no longer recognizable as the woman she had been. This wasn't random violence, it was structured, sanctioned, and sacred. Stoning required the community to participate, turning execution into a collective act of moral enforcement. Every man who threw a stone became complicit, became a guardian of order, became an enforcer of divine law. The woman's body, once part of the household and community, was now a symbol of chaos that had to be destroyed, and when it was over, when the stones had done their work, her body was often left exposed as a warning. No burial, no mourning, just a broken, blooded reminder of what happened to women who dared to defy the laws of men and gods. Fast forward nearly 3.5 millennia, and the echo of those ancient stones still rang through the streets of colonial America. In the Puritan settlements of Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Virginia, adultery was both sin and crime, punishable not by death as the Old Testament demanded, but by public flogging, the pillory, and lifelong branding. Women bore the brunt of these punishments, their bodies whipped raw in town squares, their heads and hands locked in wooden stocks as crowds hurled insults, rotten food, and stones. Some were forced to wear a scarlet letter sewn onto their clothing, a mark of shame they could never remove, ensuring that their crime followed them everywhere, forever. These weren't isolated incidents. They were the architecture of control, built across centuries and continents, all designed to teach the same lesson: a woman's body, her choices, her desires, they were never hers. They belonged to her husband, her community, her God, and when she claimed them for herself, the world responded with fire, stone, water, and rope. So here's the question we have to sit with. Which of these punishments you think left the deepest scar on society? Was it the silent erasure of sack drowning, the public spectacle of burning, the communal violence of stoning, or the permanent branding of colonial flogging? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Let's talk about what these histories reveal, not just about the past, but about the systems of power that still shape our world today. Because when morality is enforced through pain, when justice is written in blood and ash, the first thing to die ain't the body. It's the soul of the society that demanded it.